Hey, everyone. Tonight we're drifting back to a time when marital bliss among Europe's royals usually meant surviving past your wedding night without a small war, a long-term scandal, or another cousin added to the family tree. So, settle in, dim the lights, let your phone slowly slide off the side of the bed like a bored cat, and let's float gently into the soft, mildly tragic glow of European royal marriages that went, well, genetically wrong. Not catastrophically wrong. Not horror story wrong. Just quietly disastrous. In that uniquely royal way where everyone kept a straight face, while entire dynasties wilted like underwatered houseplants. We'll wander through serene corridors of palaces where people wore silk stockings, performed diplomacy exclusively through awkward family dinners, and made medical decisions based on whoever had the loudest opinion, all delivered in the spirit of bedtime calm. No rush, no judgment, just history doing that thing it loves to do, being very strange while pretending everything is perfectly ordinary. So, let's begin. Sliding into the Habsburg gene pool, let's start with the most famous example. Yes, the Habsburgs, because of course we're starting with the Habsburgs. If Europe had a prize for most committed to the bit of inbreeding, the Habsburgs would have accepted it graciously, then married the prize committee, who were also their cousins. Their motto might as well have been, "Why expand the family when you can just rotate the same set of uncles?" Tonight we're drifting into the quieter corners of their long, tangled cigar, focusing on the soothing, almost meditative predictability of a dynasty that always asked the same question. Is first cousin too distant? Or should we try a niece this time? Philip the Handsome, who was fine. Let's start with Philip the Handsome, a man known for his looks in an age when handsome meant has at least 4 teeth and fewer than 3 visible infections. Philip married Joanna of Castile, better known as Joanna the Mad, which is always a promising start. Their union was meant to fuse immense kingdoms. What it actually produced was several children, and an increasingly lopsided genetic pyramid with Philip perched at the top, smiling vacantly like he wasn't sure how he got there. Philip was technically attractive, but in that way where portraits show him looking permanently confused, like he'd been asked a question about basic arithmetic. Still, he contributed generously to the family line, offering whole handfuls of recessive traits, like Oprah giving away cars. But the real genetic story starts a little later. Charles II, the Habsburg Magazard of cousin weddings. And here he is, the quiet icon, the calm at the center of the genetic storm. Charles II of Spain. You've probably seen him. Not in Personal Assuré, a very committed time traveler, but in those portraits where he looks like a gently stunned parrot dressed in royal brocade. Charles II was the final blossom of 200 years of Habsburg marriage strategy, which, to put it softly, was focused. Very focused. So focused, in fact, that Charles had fewer ancestors than most people of grandparents, and he wasn't just inbred. He was mathematically improbable. Charles' parents were uncle and niece. His grandparents were first cousins. One set of great-grandparents was also first cousins. And so on, and so on. His family tree looked less like a tree and more like a decorative wreath. Charles himself was kind, quiet, deeply polite. He also struggled with an array of health issues, because nature eventually looked at the Habsburgs and said, "Okay, this is getting awkward." But tonight, we're keeping things soothing. So let's drift through his life gently. Think of it as whispering the world's most melancholy bedtime story. His birth was medically surprising. Charles was not expected to live very long. Doctors hovered over his cradle like confused storks, murmuring things like, "He's breathing," which is a good start, and his head is, well, it's definitely there. He had trouble walking, talking, chewing, swallowing, and performing most of the actions typically associated with being alive. But he was heir to the Spanish Empire, and in the 17th century, that meant mostly sitting still while other people argued about your fate. Which, to be fair, Charles did very well. His marriage prospects were complicated. The Spanish court arranged marriages for Charles with the same optimism someone might use to water a long-dead plant. His first bride, Marie-Louise of Orleans, arrived at the palace, took one look at the situation, and probably thought something along the lines of, "Well, this is different." She was lively, charming, fond of dancing, which immediately alarmed the Spanish court, who preferred queens to sit very quietly and only blink with written permission. Marie-Louise was also expected to produce an heir. Unfortunately, Charles' genetics had reached the stage where that wasn't going to happen, which meant the court blamed Marie-Louise because, of course, they did. One can imagine her days in Spain consisted of being politely stared at by nobles who whispered things like, "Perhaps she's not trying hard enough," while Charles sat quietly next to her, looking vaguely apologetic. Marie-Louise died young officially from appendicitis, unofficially from stress, misery, isolation, and eating nothing but Spanish court cuisine, which apparently did not help. Round 2. A bride who tried to fix everything. His second wife, Maria Hanna of Neuburg, was selected for her famously fertile family. Her sisters had so many children they were practically human confetti cannons. Naturally, the Spanish court assumed fertility ran in the family like a cheerful genetic river. But by this point, Charles' own genes were more like a stagnant pond. Maria Anna was determined. She tried, prayed. She followed medical advice that involved herbs, amulets, prayers, astrology, and probably a few things involving hot wine that no one should ever try at home. But no heir appeared. The royal doctors blamed Maria Anna. The priests blamed witches. Maria Anna blamed fate. Charles blamed himself, and quietly, gently, the Habsburg dynasty dissolved into a long, drowsy sigh. Charles too died at 38 old, for someone with his condition, young for someone meant to rule an empire. His death led directly to the War of Spanish Succession, which killed tens of thousands of people who definitely did not get a say in any of the marriages that caused the mess. Let's drift away from that. It's bedtime, after all. Let's drift now, quietly, over to Britain, a place where rain falls gently, tea cools slowly, and royal marriages have the emotional warmth of a slightly damped crumpet. The early Hanoverian kings were German imports. Parliament basically shipped them over like a flat-pack monarchy, complete with instructions that said, "Congratulations! Please, assemble your new dynasty." Minimal charisma required. They weren't chosen because they were inspiring, or popular, or even English-speaking. They were chosen because they were Protestant, and everyone else in the line of succession was a Catholic inconveniently breathing. And so began a dynasty defined by two relaxing constants: mistranslated conversations and children who despised their parents. Let's drift gently into the marriage of George I, the husband who locked his wife in a castle. George I became King of Great Britain in 1714. But long before that, he had already ensured his marriage would go down in history as one of Europe's quiet tragedies. His wife, Sophia Dorothea of Celle, was young, bright, charming, and unfortunately for her married at 16 to a man who regarded affection the way one regards unexpected mold on bread. George was stiff, stoic, and shaped roughly like a grandfather clock that had been carved without enthusiasm. Their marriage was functional. Not happy, not warm, just structurally sound, like a barn. Sophia Dorothea tried to tolerate him. She really did, but George's main hobbies were sulking, hunting, and ignoring her. So she eventually formed a gentle emotional attachment to a cavalry officer. This, as far as the Hanoverians were concerned, was treason adjacent. So the family responded with the calm, thoughtful delicacy of locking her in a castle for the rest of her life. Oh yes, the marital therapy dungeon Sophia Dorothea spent 32 years imprisoned in Castle Alden. No visitors, no sunlight, no fun, just decades of soft, echoing loneliness. George, meanwhile, continued ruling Britain while maintaining two mistresses known collectively as the Elephant and the Maypole, which were not insults, but affectionate court nicknames describing their silhouettes. Very romantic, George. I never remember. But that wasn't he? Out of devotion. It was because he simply never cared enough to bother. Let's drift on to his son, George II. A marriage that was almost healthy but not quite. George II was unusual for the Hanoverians, in that he loved his wife and liked her, and even listened to her. This made the British aristocracy extremely uncomfortable. A king expressing positive feelings toward his spouse was considered dangerously French. George married Caroline of Ansbach, a clever, diplomatic woman who worked subtly behind the scenes while her husband strutted around complaining about things, which was his favorite pastime. But the Hanoverian curse never really left them, because although the marriage was affectionate, their family life was, well, a non-stop emotional food fight. Enter Frederick, Prince of Wales. Frederick was their eldest son, a man who disliked his parents on principle. No matter what George II did, Frederick opposed it. If the king said, "Good morning," Frederick countered with, "Actually, it's afternoon somewhere." Father and son were so hostile they once celebrated each other's illnesses. Frederick threw parties when his parents felt unwell. George II was genuinely delighted when his son got hit by a cricket ball. It was that kind of love. Frederick marries. Unhappily, Frederick wed Princess Augusta of Saxe, who arrived in Britain at 16 with minimal English and maximum optimism. She soon discovered that Frederick was a man with the personality of a slightly dented pewter. They had many children, mostly because Augusta was committed, and Frederick was bored. But their marriage was essentially two parallel lives, touching occasionally, like two ships passing in the night, one of which was on fire. Frederick died before becoming king. George II reportedly said, "Thank God," which is not a typical response to the death of one's heir. But consistency was not the Hanoverian strong suit. Let's keep drifting. George III. A marriage that started well and ended quietly in pain. George III is usually summarized as the mad king who lost America, which is technically correct, but also incomplete. In truth, his life was a long, somber melody of duty, routine, moral, earnest, and later on mental illness that the royal doctors treated with all the subtlety of a marching band. But before that, he married Charlotte of Mecklenburg, a teenager who arrived in England knowing about 3 words of English, all of which she used immediately in her wedding vows. They met for the first time 6 hours before the ceremony, which sounds shocking until you remember that their engagement had been arranged through letters, written by other people who had also never met. Despite all that, the marriage worked quietly, calmly, almost sweetly. Charlotte was intelligent, artistic, and patient. George was earnest, awkward, and slightly shaped like a decorative butter churn. Their union produced 15 children. Yes, 15, which is impressive, though one suspects Charlotte was kept pregnant like a seasonal tradition. But then George developed mental illness. Not all at once. Slowly, like fog creeping across a field. And the marriage shifted. Charlotte became frightened of him. He became frightened of himself. Their later years were marked by physical distance and emotional heartbreak that no one understood well enough to heal. Quiet tragedy is still tragedy, even whispered. Let's step softly away from that and drift to the next royal calamity. Let's drift now into the nurseries of medieval and early modern Europe, places that were less soft blankets and warm milk and more drafty stone rooms, unpredictable adults, and a rotating cast of diseases. Royal childhoods are often imagined as golden, tiny crowns, velvet cradles, lullabies sung by well-paid choirs. But the reality was usually closer to, "Here's your nursemaid. She's had the plague twice. Good luck." Tonight, very gently, we're drifting through those early years when future kings and queens were shaped not by comfort, but by fear, cold, political pressure, and the occasional near-fatal misunderstanding of infant nutrition. Let's start with a classic, Richard the Lionheart. Raised to fight, not to feel. Richard I of England, the famous crusader, the heroic icon. The man Hollywood insists was handsome, even though portraits suggest he had the emotional range of a salted herring. Richard's childhood was, let's say, focused. His mother, Eleanor of Aquitaine, was dazzling and politically brilliant. His father, Henry II, was also dazzling and politically brilliant. Unfortunately, they hated each other slightly more than they loved their children. So Richard grew up in a world where affection was something you earned by not rebelling. And even then, it wasn't guaranteed. As a boy, he was taught the essentials: riding, hunting, swordsmanship, poetic insults to hurl at the French, but not the more subtle arts, like emotional intimacy, conflict resolution, or how to spend more than 3 minutes sitting still without planning a rebellion. By the time he reached adolescence, Richard was essentially a very expensive weapon with a crown-shaped accessory. Not much softness there, not much comfort, but very, very good for the royal brand. Let's glide to France. Charles VI of France, a childhood doomed by family traditions. Charles VI is best known as Charles the Mad, which is both unkind and historically accurate. His childhood was technically privileged. AID tutors, servants, silks, the whole package. But he also had something less helpful: a family tree, stuffed with mental illness wrapped neatly inside centuries of cousin marriage. It's soothing to imagine him as a child, a quiet boy, in an ornate nursery, playing with miniature knights, while adults whispered anxiously behind doors. His uncles ran the kingdom. His advisors micromanaged his day. Doctors interpreted every sneeze as a sign from God. And Charles, with his bright, sensitive mind, grew into a young man who simply carried too much expectation for someone with genetics held together by hope and prayer. When his mental illness appeared in his 20s, everyone acted surprised, which, frankly, is surprising. Let's drift to England again. Edward VI, the boy king who was mostly tuberculosis in human form. Edward VI, son of Henry VIII and Jane Seymour, became king at 9, which is adorable, and also a terrible idea. Edward's childhood was the royal equivalent of he was frail from birth, pale, thin, and shaped a bit like a question mark. The court reacted to this by panicking constantly. His tutors drilled him in Latin, Greek, theology, and politics. His doctors gave contradictory advice like, "Let the boy rest," and wake him immediately for more leeching. No wonder he looked exhausted in every portrait. Edward was intelligent, devout, and serious, but childhood joy, not really on the menu. When he became king, real adults ran everything while Edward signed papers and tried not to cough too loudly. He died at 15, probably from a combination of tuberculosis, bad medical advice, and the Tudor tradition of never letting anyone get fresh air. But softly, we move on. Isabella of Valois, married at 6, widow at 11. This is a childhood story that makes modern listeners blink slowly in disbelief. Isabella of Valois was a little French princess who enjoyed dolls, ribbons, and peaceful lessons in courtly behavior. Then one day, adults informed her she would be marrying the King of England, who was a grown man in his 40s. She was 6. Richard II was old enough to have opinions about tax reform. Everyone assured her it was fine. Political necessity, alliance, diplomacy, all the usual soothing nonsense adults use when ruining children's lives. To his credit, Richard treated her gently, mostly as a symbolic daughter figure. They didn't live as husband and wife, but Isabella still had to perform the role of queen as a child who couldn't read most of her own official letters. Then Richard was deposed and murdered. Isabella was 11, a widow, a political pawn. Her childhood ended before it really began. Let's float away from that one gently. Slow breaths, soft step, Ivan the Terrible. A childhood built entirely out of trauma. We often think of Ivan IV as the man who murdered his son, terrorized his nobles, and invented entirely new ways to ruin a Tuesday. But the roots of Ivan's violence were planted early, in a childhood that would have broken almost anyone. By the age of 8, Ivan had lost both parents. His guardians, The boyar nobles treated him and his younger brother like unwanted houseplants, occasionally watered, never loved, and frequently knocked over during political arguments. Ivan grew up in cold halls filled with fear and casual cruelty. Servants stole his food. Nobles beat him for fun. He learned early that no one would protect him. By 30, the trauma had calcified into something sharp. Ivan responded by having one of his tormentors torn apart by dogs, which, while dramatic, was also the only form of justice he'd ever seen modeled. It's not soothing, but it does explain things. We'll drift back to Western Europe. Louis XIV, the child who was terrified of riots, then spent 72 years avoiding everyone. Louis XIV, the Sun King, the man who dressed like a chandelier and basically invented royal influencer culture, had a childhood that explains everything. When he was 5, Paris erupted in revolt. The Fronde rebels stormed the royal palace. Little Louis lay trembling in bed as armed men burst into his room. He never forgot it. It settled into his bones, a lifelong fear of disorder, chaos, and people who didn't admire him enough. So when he grew up, he created Versailles, a place where no one could rebel because they were too busy getting lost in the hallways. Childhood fear, dressed up later as gold leaf and etiquette. Let's drift along. Mary, Queen of Scots. A childhood abroad, and not by choice. Mary became queen at 6 days old, a very stressful age to assume executive responsibility. Scotland was too dangerous for her, so she was shipped to France, a charming diplomatic gesture that basically turned her into a living alliance. Her childhood was a mix of French elegance, political tutoring, and the constant awareness that her very existence was a chess piece in European strategy. She was raised alongside the French royal children, including the boys she was meant to marry. Everyone assumed this was romantic. Mary probably assumed it was normal. Her adulthood would unravel spectacularly, but the seeds were planted early. A girl raised to be a symbol rather than a person. We'll float away gently. We've already drifted through the Habsburgs, which means we've covered the Olympic champions of genetic misadventure. But don't worry, they were not the only ones. Europe's royal families loved a closed gene pool. They treated their dynasties like exclusive clubs where outsiders needed not apply, even when outsiders had traits like healthy organs or functional immune systems. So now, let's float gently into the quieter, Lizernon tragedies, the marriages that didn't collapse empires in a fiery blaze, but slowly, softly, dimmed the health of entire bloodlines. Let's begin with a kingdom that always tried its best and usually failed, the Portuguese House of Braganza. When a dynasty accidentally turned into a medical case study, Portugal in the 17th and 18th centuries was a place of warm sun, gentle breezes, and royals with, let's call them, inconsistent health profiles. The Braganzas didn't inbreed as enthusiastically as the Habsburgs, but they still indulged in cousin marriages, the way some families indulge in board games during holidays, not mandatory, but traditional. Afonso VI, the king who was technically married, but not functionally, Afonso VI became king at 13, after a childhood stroke left him partially paralyzed and mentally impaired. Doctors described him with phrases like challenging constitution, which is court speak for things are not going well. He married Marie Francoise of Savoy. She, unfortunately, discovered on their wedding night that Afonso had the romantic capacity of a wilted fern and the physical capacity of, well, someone who'd had a childhood stroke and no medical support. After 2 years of marriage without any of the usual marital results, she petitioned for an Afonso's brother. Pedro supported her. The marriage was dissolved. Marie Francoise immediately married Pedro, because apparently that was the fastest upgrade available. Afonso spent the rest of his life sidelined, a soft, sad figure wandering palace halls, occasionally attempting to rule, but mostly being gently ignored. Let's drift to another Iberian dynasty, the House of Bourbon, a collection of fragile princes held together by lace collars. The Bourbons were fashionable, elegant, refined, and frequently ill. This was partly due to cousin marriage, partly due to poor medical decisions, and partly because the French court believed fresh air was for peasants. Louis XV's children. Survival was not a family strength. Louis XV and Queen Marie Lasciska had 10 children who survived infancy, which sounds impressive until you realize they also had several who lost quietly to the usual childhood enemies, measles, fevers, and 18th century doctors. The daughters who survived grew into adulthood with delicate health and fewer marital prospects each year. Not because they weren't charming, they were, but because Louis XV refused to let them marry. He kept them at Versailles as emotional support ornaments, while he focused on By the time they were in their 30s, they were essentially the royal version of houseplants that had been owned too long to gift to anyone else. Their health never thrived. Isolation rarely does wonders for the immune system. Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, a marriage that began with 8 years of awkward silence. Louis XVI had a medical issue that made consummation difficult. Historians debate what it was: phimosis, emotional anxiety, or just extreme, Olympic-level awkwardness. Whatever the cause, his marriage to Marie Antoinette went unconsummated for 7 or 8 years. European courts whispered, letters flew. Maria Teresa, Marie Antoinette's mother, wrote long, passive-aggressive letters urging her daughter to kindly make an effort. Meanwhile, Louis XVI, shaped like a benevolent barrel and fond of locks, tools, and avoiding human contact, simply could not make anything happen. When the marriage finally became functional, everyone celebrated like it was a royal coronation. All over 2 very anxious teenagers. Let's drift away from France. The Romanovs, where elegance met hemophilia. No royal genetic saga is complete without the Russian Romanovs and their famous medical curse. The problem began in Britain. Because of course it did. Queen Victoria, the accidental distributor of hemophilia Victoria, carried the gene for hemophilia, a blood disorder that prevents clotting. She passed it to several children, who passed it into European royal houses like a quiet, tragic party favor. One of those carriers was Alexandra, granddaughter of Victoria, who married Nicholas II of Russia. Their son, Alexei, inherited hemophilia, and every bruise became a medical emergency. The royal family became desperate. Enter Rasputin, the mystic healer with unsettling eyes, questionable hygiene, and the soothing ability to slightly reduce Alexei's symptoms, probably by preventing doctors from doing things like shaking the child, bleeding him with leeches. Reporting his condition to newspapers, Alexei survived into adolescence, but never lived without fear. The royal family lived in constant, quiet terror. A child who couldn't run, couldn't climb, couldn't fall without risking death. Genetics can be heartbreakingly soft in its cruelty. Let's glide away from Russia. The Danish royal disaster, Christian VII, and the sadness of a lost-mind Christian. VII of Denmark was another royal whose marriage folded under the weight of mental illness and court dysfunction. He married Caroline Matilda of Great Britain, a teenage princess who arrived with hope, fresh English manners, and no idea what she'd signed up for. Christian suffered from severe mental illness, likely schizophrenia or related conditions, made worse by abuse, trauma, and neglect. Their marriage deteriorated immediately. Christian alternated between paranoia, cruelty, and childlike fragility. Caroline Matilda lived in isolation until she formed a bond, and maybe more, with the king's physician, Johann Struensee. Struensee became regent. Caroline Matilda became the subject of scandal, and Christian drifted through it all, confused and frightened. A gentle reminder that royal marriages could be victims of far more than genetics. Let's drift softly forward. Now we're drifting into one of my favorite corners of royal history. The quiet, petty disasters, the small-scale meltdowns, the royal tantrums that changed absolutely nothing in the grand scheme of world events, yet somehow defined entire reigns. These are the monarchs who didn't spark massive wars or collapse empires. They just made everyone around them deeply, existentially tired. Soft dysfunction, gentle chaos, regal nonsense. Let's start with someone who practically perfected the art. James I of England. The original I'd prefer not to monarch. James I was brilliant, scholarly, and surprisingly bad at being king. His childhood had been a genre of psychological horror, constant fear of kidnapping, assassination, and the occasional palace explosion. So, by adulthood, he just wanted everyone to behave themselves. Unfortunately, no one ever did. James disliked confrontation. Deeply, he would procrastinate decisions with a level of commitment that makes modern students look ambitious. His method of governance was basically avoid problems, hope they resolve themselves. Write a long, slightly anxious essay about how kingship is hard. His court knew this and treated every decision like a group project where the king was the member who promised he'd do it later tonight and definitely did not. His marriages, by which I mean his children's marriages. James married Anne of Denmark, a woman who brought warmth, charm, and a mild desire to redecorate the entire country. Their marriage worked, short of. They disagreed about everything from religion to interior design, but coexisted like two politely feuding houseplants. Their son, Charles I, inherited both parents' worst qualities: James's indecision and Anne's stubbornness, which was not the ideal combination for someone meant to navigate a brewing civil war. We'll drift away from that looming disaster and towards something a little pettier. Queen Anne, a reign fueled largely by hurt feelings. Queen Anne, last of the Stuarts, was soft-spoken, Italy influenced, and desperately attached to her closest friends, which is sweet. Until you realize her friendships were essentially political hand grenades. Her relationship with Sarah Churchill, the famously sharp Duchess, was legendary. Sarah was intelligent, witty, and treated Anne with the energizing warmth of a strict Victorian governess. Anne, who longed for affection and support, clung to Sarah tightly, until their friendship exploded in a cloud of passive-aggressive letters and emotional exhaustion. Sarah once wrote in scolding notes that read like the 18th century version of "We Need to Talk." Anne responded by slow fading her, which is one of the few powers monarchs and introverts share. Eventually, Sarah was replaced by Abigail Massam, a gentler lady-in-waiting who mostly offered tea and soothing compliments. Sarah accused Abigail of manipulation and eventually blocked Sarah on all 18th century communication channels, which included physically refusing her entrance to the palace. It was all wildly petty and incredibly human, and somehow influenced the politics of the entire kingdom. Let's float further into dysfunction. Charles IV of France, a man who failed at nearly everything, including being petty Charles IV, last of the direct Capetian line, was the royal equivalent of an unfinished sentence. He wasn't cruel, he wasn't inspiring, he simply existed in a kind of beige fog. Everything he tried went slightly wrong in a way that was almost calming. He tried to fix the French economy. It got worse. He attempted diplomacy. Everyone got confused. He started a war. Forgot about it, then remembered again when someone sent him a letter. Even his marriages had a sleepy quality. His wives were young, gentle, and tired of him almost immediately. His reign ended quietly, with no heir, no triumphs, and no scandals exciting enough to wake the court from their polite drowsiness. History remembers him mostly for not being remembered. Let's drift gently onward. Charles IX of France, a king tormented by his own family group. Charles IX ascended the French throne as a teenager, surrounded by the world's worst influence group. His mother, Catherine de' Medici, his ambitious siblings, nobles who enjoyed civil war the way some people enjoy cheese plates. Charles was anxious, easily swayed, and shaped like someone who apologized to furniture after bumping into it. He became king during the Wars of Religion, a series of Catholic-Protestant conflicts that made everyone testy. And Catherine, being Catherine, guided her son with the subtlety of a bulldozer. Charles spent much of his reign being pressured into decisions he didn't want to make. Easily the worst was the St. Bartholomew Day massacre, a spiral of violence he couldn't stop and barely understood, after which he was never mentally well again. He died at 23, exhausted, traumatized, and probably whispering, "I don't want to be king anymore," into the nearest tapestry. Let's drift away from France and toward the more melodramatic corners of Central Europe. Wenceslas IV of Bohemia. The king who mostly wanted to nap. Wenceslas had potential. He just didn't enjoy doing things. He was intelligent, yes, but also profoundly uninterested in actually ruling. Groups of nobles would show up to meetings only to discover the king was still asleep at noon or off hunting with the enthusiasm he never devoted to governance. Eventually, he was kidnapped by angry aristocrats. Twice, which suggests his leadership style may have lacked discipline. His response to stress was to drink heavily and then drink more heavily. He died surrounded by dogs, literally, not metaphorically, which is at least a peaceful way to finish things out. Let's drift into one of my favorite mild disasters. Christian II of Denmark, a royal with the emotional stability of a damp rag Christian. Too was a king who made decisions the way most people choose microwave settings, impulsively and with no follow-through. His pettiness was legendary. He once became so angry at the Swedish nobility that he ordered an execution spree so large it earned the cheerful name the Stockholm Bloodbath, not his most calming moment. Back home, he became infatuated with the Dutch commoner, de Vaki, and insisted on keeping her at court, even after marrying a proper princess. Windevik, dead, possibly poisoned, Christian spiraled into dramatic paranoia and accused everyone of everything. Eventually, he was deposed and imprisoned. His final years were spent in a damp fortress, where he probably had plenty of time to reflect on the consequences of emotional impulsivity. Let's drift away gently. Philip V of Spain, the king who occasionally forgot he was king. Philip V was the first Bourbon king of Spain, and he came with a collection of emotional and psychological struggles the royal doctors didn't understand and definitely didn't improve. At times he refused to get out of bed, not out of laziness, more like heavy, unmanageable depression. He sometimes believed he was made of glass, sometimes thought he couldn't die, occasionally insisted he smelled terrible, even after bathing, which suggests his physicians were not the most emotionally supportive. His wife, Elizabeth Farnese, essentially ran Spain, while he drifted between lucidity and episodes so severe the court treated him like a delicate antique vase. It wasn't petty, it wasn't dramatic. It was simply sad, another royal life, weighed down by untreated illness. Let's drift toward the Ottoman Empire for some gentle palace drama. Selim II, the Sultan who outsourced his job to literally everyone else. Selim II, also known as Selim the Sot, was not particularly interested in ruling an empire. He preferred wine, poetry, and avoiding responsibility with the soft grace of a man who understood his limits. His mother, his advisors, his wife, his favorites, they all ran the empire while Selim floated serenely through life, making minimal decisions and maximum use of palace amenities. His reign wasn't catastrophic, just directionless, like a boat that drifts gently because the captain is napping. He died from slipping on a wet floor in a bathhouse, which is perhaps the least violent demise any Ottoman ruler ever achieved. Let's drift onward.